the width to be 1280 and the height to be 720, and we assign these values to two variables, which are screen width and screen height. Then we use the Pygame functions to initialize the display. Here we set the display mode. So we're creating our display variable and assigning the width and the height. We're giving it a background color, which in this case is white. And then here we go through our main loop, and we're checking for events, for keyboard events. If this is the X, if we're clicking on the X, then it's exiting, then it exits our game. Here we are outside of the for loop, so once the for loop is done, we run these three functions right here. So we flip the display, we update, and we set the FPS. Now this is like some basic stuff that you need to hard code and to know. And now we're gonna move on to the fun stuff. So let's create a new script and call it snakehead.py. Alright, so this is gonna be the head of our snake, which is the main little cube that's moving, that we control through the keyboard or the AWSD keys. So first, let's import our Pygame library as usual. Alright, and let's create our class, and we'll call it snakehead. Let's define our init function. It's going to take, of course, self, then a position X, position Y, and a width and a height. So these are the width and height of our head. This is the position X and position Y, the screen position. So for these I need to explain to you something. Let me open Paint. Alright, just to explain, let's say this is our game display. Alright, let's assume that this this box right here is our game display. Find my mouse. So when we're drawing in computer graphics, the coordinates, we use a coordinate system that is somewhat like our math graphing system, but a bit different. So the x coordinates, so let me just draw this. Alright, so this is the y right here, the y, so this is our y right here. This is the y. Right. And right here we have the x. So the x goes like this and the y goes like this. So for the x moving right, the x increases. So here, let's say we go from 0 all the way. So let's say this is our display. Okay, this is our game display right there. And so for the x coordinates, here we start at 0 and we go all the way to the screen width. Alright, so in this case we set it to 1280, right, like this, right? And for the y coordinates, right, so this is the x, right, moving this way we increase. The y coordinates, on the other hand, for computer graphics is the opposite. It increases going down. Now if you remember in your math class, let's say we had a graph, a y and an x. When you increase the x, the function, let's say it increases, well, when the function increases, the y increases. So in math, the y increases when you go up. But in computer graphic, it's quite the opposite. So we start here at 0 and we finish at the screen height right there. So in this case, this is 0 and this is 720. So let's say we wanted to put them in a coordinate system. This would be 0, 0. So x and y. Here we have 1280, 0. Here we have 1280, 720. And finally here we have 0, 720. Alright, so this is how the coordinates work. So this is what I mean by position x and position y. Alright, so now let's just create these variables. So we'll say self dot position x equal position x, self dot position y equals position y, self dot width equals width, self dot height equals height. And then let's create another variable, call it self dot movement, and make it equal to 0. And if you don't understand the purpose of this yet, don't worry, because I'll explain it later on. Now what we can do is go here into our main.py and import our snakehead class that we just created. Alright, and then what we can do here is create a snakehead. So let's create a snakehead object or instance. We'll call it a head or s head equals snakehead dot, and then the name of the class, capital S snakehead, and then in parentheses we put all the we assign the values of all the variables that we set here. So we'll put them inside, we'll assign them, and then the program here is gonna assign these values to the variables that we created. So for the position y, we want our snake head to first spawn into the middle of our screen. Alright, so here we're gonna have a position x, a position y, and a width and a height. Alright, now for to make it a bit more simpler and more understandable, let's just hard code these values and not use any variables. Let's use 16 and 16. So the snake will be 16 by 16, alright? Now the position X, we wanted to print it at the center of our screen. So if I go back here, I wanted to print it at the very center. However, in computer programming, whenever you set a position to print a rectangle, so you give it a position, and the computer is going to consider it as the top left corner of that rectangle. So if we print it, if we set the positions to be the width divided by 2 and the height divided by 2, it's going to put the program, the computer, the script, is going to put a point at the very center of our display and consider it as the top left corner of our rectangle. So then it's going to proceed to draw the rectangle as follows. It's going to go like this and draw the rectangle. That's not what we want to do, right? Because even though this point will be at the center of the screen, the center of the rectangle will not be at the center of the screen. So what we need to do is offset this by a bit. So move it a bit to the left and move it a bit up. How much? Well, we have to move it by half the width and half the height of our head snake object. So if I go back, the position X would be the screen width divided by 2, and then minus 16 divided by 2, 16 divided by 2, which is 8. But let's just keep it like that, because that's what I explained. So this goes to the center of the screen, the center width of the screen, and then it moves it a little bit more, just to make sure that the center of our head is at the center of our game display. And let's do the same thing with the position Y. So let's take screen height divided by 2 minus 16 divided by 2. So we just created a snake head object. Now nothing's gonna be displayed on the screen, because for that we need to create a function that draws our snake onto the display. So let's create that function and call it draw. Alright, so any function in a class must take the self object, must take a self parameter, and then something else that we want to pass into this function as an input will be the display. Let's put some colon. Alright, so to draw a rectangle into our display, we have to use the this function. So it's called pygame.draw.rect, and this takes 3 parameters. First, it takes the display, then it takes a list for the RGB color. So let me just add it here. And finally, it's going to take another list for the position X, position Y, width, and height of our rectangle. And then we have the coordinates / dimensions. So for the RGB, since the display is already white, we want the snake head to be a black. Alright, for that, for black we need 0, 0, and 0. That means we have no color, in other words, black. So here let's put self dot position X. For the coordinates we have self dot position Y, and for the dimensions we have self dot width comma self dot height. Alright, so let me just explain what's going on here. When we create our snake head, this is gonna be our position X, this is gonna be our position Y, this is gonna be our width, and this is gonna be our height, because that's what we're putting it here. Alright, and then the program will take these values and assign them to these variables called self.position X, self.position Y, self.width, and self.height. And we're using these same variables here to draw our snake head wherever we want it to be. So this is our draw function. So what we can do now, is go here, and then each time the loop is over, what we can do is say s head, so snake head, dot draw. So at each frame, it's gonna run this function and draw a rectangle at the position that we have defined. So now if you run this program, okay, so here we have an error. It says that we need a display. So right here we need to input a display because we added this right here. So for that, let's just say pygame. Let's put in our display like this and run it. As you can see, we have a square or a snake head, and each and every tick or 0.24 of a second, a new rectangle is being drawn into the screen, and then it does this at 4 times per second. So that's cool. We can see we just generated a rectangle, and it is exactly at the center of our screen. So now the next step is to create some movement. Alright, so let's create a function right here. Define the function, call it move. So we'll have a function that will read our keyboard input, and another one that will move the snake. So let's just create a function that reads the keyboard input. So read input. And for that, we need, of course, self, and we'll need a key. Let's just call it key. So this is gonna be the key that's being pressed. And then we need to check if key is equal to pygame dot k for key underscore a. Alright, so if the a key is being pressed, here we're going to use this movement variable that we created. Alright, so we're going to set the movement equal to 1. So this is just a code that we're creating for ourselves. So we're saying that the a corresponds to 1. Let's make, for example, let's make an else if statement. Else if, meaning if this statement is not true, check for this statement instead. Else if the key is equal to pygame dot k underscore d, meaning we're going right, let's make the movement equal to 2. Self.movement variable, let's make it equal to 2. Alright, let's make another else if statement. The key is equal to pygame dot k underscore w, so the w key is being pressed. Let's make the self.movement variable equal to 3. And finally, else if the key is equal to pygame dot k underscore s. Let's make the movement variable equal to 4. Now this is just a very simple way of doing it. If you don't like this, then we can make it, for example, a string. So if you prefer, we can say let's make it null. When we initialize it, it's going to be equal to null, and then we can say right, we can say left, we can say here top or up, and here down. Now this is another way of dealing with the problem, and if you prefer it, we can use this instead of using 1, 2, 3, 4, as it may be a little bit less confusing. So let's go with this instead.